Andy.
Yeah, it's all right.
Sorry, it's Andy, the man there behind the bar. Thank you, Andy. We
Nice
did.
bookstore, so check it out.
Yeah, wonderful books here and drinks, so you don't feel like you're missing the wind-up space too much, and they're wonderful bartenders. And I guess we should get started. So we're very fortunate to have with us tonight a couple of writers who are sort of a departure from our normal Baltimore focus. You know, one of what we try to do, part of what we try to do with New Mercury is build community, and that's why we most often host writers from the area, but we're always happy to have people come to us from outside of Baltimore, and tonight we've been fortunate to have a couple of folks who are kind of going to give us a different perspective. Our first reader is Ben Hellwarth. Ben grew up in Los Angeles and began reporting, writing, and editing for papers in the Bay Area after graduating from the University of California, Berkeley. He won a number of notable journalism awards in the 1990s as a staff writer for the Santa Barbara News Press, then part of the New York Times regional newspaper group. He currently lives with his family in Western Pennsylvania, and he's here tonight reading for us from his book, Sealab, which is his first book. Ben?
Thank you, Deborah. It's, do I need to do something with the mic, or am I okay here? It's good to be here with you in Baltimore. There's an ocean right off the city here, so that brings us right to the story of Sealab, which, as you can guess, is a story that has something to do with the ocean. The subtitle, America's Forgotten Quest to Live and Work on the Ocean Floor, which incidentally was just recognized by Publishers Weekly magazine as subtitle of the week, so I took that to be a great compliment. I'll just start out by just telling you a little bit about what Sealab is, because as I've learned in the reporting and research of this story, a lot of people either never heard of it or don't remember it. And really what Sealab was like an underwater version of what NASA was doing in space, an underwater version of the Mercury project. Instead of trying to figure out how to reach the moon and to launch astronauts into space, Sealab was really about trying to figure out how to get divers to the ocean floor where they could live and work out of something like an underwater space station to do whatever kinds of jobs they might do down there. Now this might sound relatively simple to send divers to the ocean floor, but it wasn't. And if it were simple, I guess I probably wouldn't have just written a whole book about the process of getting down there. It was something like space, in that there were a lot of the same challenges to the human body. There were questions of breathing gases, there was the pressure, there was the cold of the water, there was prototype equipment that sometimes worked better than other times, and appearances by sea life that you didn't expect. So all of this was in the realm of challenges of what these guys were trying to do. Not everybody in the Navy thought it was such a great idea to get involved in this project of creating the marine equivalent of a space station. So as often is the case, it takes sort of a special character who comes along sometimes and says, hey, we ought to do this. And in the Navy, there happened to be a Navy doctor by the name of George Bond, who was a sort of adventuresome character, a bit fearless, a little bit pushy, and really just the kind of character it was going to take to get a project like Sealab off the ground. And you'll get a sense of that when I read you just the opening of the book here, in which Bond is about to try to pull off a feat that not everybody thinks is such a good idea. 300 feet down, deeper than most divers were equipped to go, the World War II-era submarine Archerfish prepared to release 2 passengers into a dim sea with little more than the breath they held in their lungs. A spate of foul weather and strong currents had complicated some trial runs, but now, early on the first day of October, 1959, the sun came up with just a few wispy clouds on the horizon. In calm water, the sub set out from the U.S. Navy base at Key West, headed southwest into the Gulf of Mexico. The mission's unusual aim was to prove that a trapped submariner could reach the distant service on his own, and live to tell about it. No sub-escape quite like this had ever been made, and not everyone was convinced it was a good idea to try. But one of the passengers, Commander George Bond, a Navy doctor, had argued for attempting to make the escape. As was typical of him, he had also argued that he should be the one to do it. George Bond was 43, though his soft features and jowls made him look older. He was a couple of inches over 6 feet, barrel-chested and thickly built, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and owlish dark eyebrows. Bond had joined the Navy just a few years before, but he already had a reputation for being a maverick with a fondness for showboating. He preferred not to be photographed without his pipe. Daring, gregarious, kind-hearted, even his detractors found him difficult not to like. He often lapsed into the disarming Appalachian brogue of the clients he had served not so long ago as a country doctor. His resonant baritone, noticeably seasoned somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, had the soothing, unhurried intonation of a storyteller sent from heaven. It was a voice that had served him well as a lay preacher back home in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Dr. Bond had recently become head of the Medical Research Laboratory at the U.S. Naval Submarine Base at New London, Connecticut. Most American submariners got their specialized schooling at the base, which was named for New London, but was actually in neighboring Groton on the eastern bank of the Thames River. Scientists employed at the base's medical lab concerned themselves with a variety of physiological puzzles, such as those related to submarine escape, which was how Bond got involved in making this 300-foot escape. But what really interested him was not so much the submarine aspect of during his Navy years, but was diving. He, as part of his training to be a submarine medical officer, he was also trained as a diver, and he got fascinated with diving, and especially the idea that there were such limits on diving, because for the whole history of diving, divers could not go very deep and could not stay very long, a matter of minutes, and no significant depth. And we're talking about, around the 100-foot range maybe or something. And so Bond is thinking, well, why is this? It's the dawn of the space age, and diving is kind of locked in some sense in the 19th century. And it seems like if we could just overcome these limits somehow, sort of like they broke the sound barrier with aviation, then think of the things we could do in the ocean. We could send people to much greater depths. They could live down there for military purposes, industrial purposes, scientific expeditions, whatever we wanted to do. But of course, first you have to figure out how to get there. So now that Bond's at this medical lab, he has the personnel around and the resources to start to do the tests, much as they were doing in space, first using animals and then later people, to see if people were going to be able to handle the pressures, the exotic breathing gas mixtures, the prototype equipment, and the other things that were going to be factors in trying to break these depth barriers, essentially, that had existed throughout the history of diving. And I'll read a short section to explain a little bit about Bond's thinking here, which incidentally people thought sounded a little crazy at the time. To fully explore and exploit the seas, man had to be able to swim freely like a fish, or for that matter, like his primeval self. With a specially designed sea dwelling as a base, divers could live and work on the ocean floor for days, weeks, even months at a time. From a pressurized seafloor base with the proper dive gear, they could pop any time into the surrounding water, day or night. They could then spend hours in the water, working or exploring, and return to their base as needed for food and shelter, like weary mountaineers retiring to a cozy, well-stocked tent, or astronauts to a moon base. There were just a couple of fuzzy spots in Bond's vision. One was that no such sea dwelling had ever been built. The other made the whole concept of living and working in the sea seem even more far-fetched than putting a man on the moon. Long accepted deep diving limits typically allowed for bottom times of scant minutes. The deeper the dive, the shorter a diver's stay. No one spent hours or days in the sea, nor did they spend long periods exposed to high pressure. The depth limit for most Navy divers, even for brief sojourns, was far less than Bond's initial target of 600 feet. So he's got his sight sets way beyond not just what the normal depth limit would be, but far beyond the normal duration limits, hours, days, and weeks instead of minutes. So you can see where people were kind of scratching their heads a little bit at this idea. So he is at the medical research lab, is able to do tests using pressure simulators. Think of them as flight simulators for divers, where first with animals and then human volunteers, are locked into these chambers to see how they do, breathing these unusual gas mixtures, which is to say something other than the normal air we're breathing here that's necessary to breathe under great pressure underwater. So that works out okay. It looks like this isn't going to kill anybody, although they're not sure yet, and they've only gone to certain depths and certain durations, so it's anybody's guess still. But the important thing is that that Bond gets permission to take this experimentation out to sea. So they finally get out of the laboratory and into the ocean with the very first sea base, America's first sea base called Sealab 1, off the coast of Bermuda, depth of almost 200 feet. 200 feet then being quite a deep dive for a conventional diver, and for maybe a few minutes. And these guys were planning to stay 3 weeks. So you kind of get a sense of the scale of what they're doing there. They are lowered to the base in a kind of pressurized elevator from which they swim over to the base. And what I want to do right now is play you a short clip from a recording of those first moments when the divers swim into Sealab 1. Now what's interesting to me about this, and was fascinating for me to hear, and you'll be among the first people on the planet to hear this thing almost since it was recorded, is that this is sort of the eagle has landed moment of undersea exploration. This is Neil Armstrong saying one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Only the coverage of this was very sketchy at the time, and throughout the Sealab program, as I found in my research. And one of the bits of information I was able to dig up was a whole bunch of unmarked reel-to-reel tapes, if anybody remembers that format. And so in listening to all these tapes, among them was this. And you also notice the effect of the high percentage of helium in the gases they're breathing. And you'll also hear the voice of Dr. George Bond, who's at the surface in his command module, speaking with the guys who are the first ones to enter Sealab 1.
Sealab Control, I hear you loud and clear, and I believe that is Robert A. Barth, QMC. Am I correct? Over. You're the first one in, eh, Lester Anderson? Well, Lester Anderson, congratulations. Were you able to hold your breath all the way, or did you have to breathe some water? That was a pretty good swim, wasn't it? As long as you made it. In what order are the others going to come down, Andy? I'll wait one.
So welcome to Sealab 1. That's a historic moment. That's July 20th, 1964, as I mentioned, off the coast of Bermuda, and they've got this thing set up. And the first American aquanauts are about to see if they survive for 3 weeks on the ocean floor. And I guess you have to read the book to find out how it goes. No, Sealab 1 is a very low budget operation, but goes well enough that there comes Sealab 2, bigger budget, more refined Sealab habitat, placed off the coast of California in more hostile conditions to see if, unlike Bermuda, where the water is kind of warm and clear, they can pull this off in colder, darker water, which is more like most of the Earth's oceans. And Sealab 2, despite some close calls, goes relatively well. The profile is raised partly by the addition of Scott Carpenter to the program. His name, you probably know, is the second American to orbit the Earth. famous Mercury 7, one of the famous Mercury 7 astronauts, and Carpenter himself finds out just how rigorous and difficult this undersea living business can be compared to the weightlessness of space and that sort of thing. With things like the addition of Scott Carpenter to the program, the additional money and budget, there comes Sealab 3, which is going to be by far the most ambitious Sealab, again off the coast of California. This time they're going for 600 feet, which is kind of off the charts, but to really demonstrate just the depths to which people could go and the possibilities that were there. They've got scientists, civilian scientists lined up, a bunch of military and scientific programs planned over the course of 2 months. And as I'll read you here to give you a sense of it, things get off to a rough start with Sealab 3 for a number of reasons that are detailed in the book. But you'll get a sense here that a bit of a Murphy's Law sort of day is starting to break here, as two divers are getting ready to enter the lab, much as the voices of those you heard here were swimming into Sealab 1. This pair was swimming to Sealab 3 to open the hatch and prepare it for occupancy. They have also been lowered to the bottom in this sort of pressurized pod of an elevator. That was a technology that was sort of refined and improved upon as time went along. And in the pod are the two characters I'm talking about here are a Navy diver named Bob Barth, who you meet in the book because he's involved from the very first human laboratory test experiments right through this incident I'm describing here. And also the other name you'll hear is that of Barry Cannon, who was one of the Sealab 3 aquanauts, as they were called, and had also been on Sealab 2, so he was another experienced guy. And they have just been lowered to 600 feet in the Pacific Ocean. The lowering took almost an hour, and long before the PTC, which is Personnel Transfer Capsule, that was the acronym for the pod, long before the PTC reached its destination, about 20 feet from the bottom, the foursome inside had been chilled to the bone. Their capsule was acting as much like a refrigerator as an elevator. Its electric heater was out of order, which might have been bearable, especially to a band of divers accustomed to inhospitable conditions. But a deflector was also missing on the carbon dioxide scrubber, and it blew what felt like an unrelenting Arctic wind. Helium further sapped everyone's body heat, and the divers' standard neoprene wetsuits, compressed and thinned under pressure, provided little warmth. They all felt cold to the core. Barth was sure he had never been so cold. Upon arrival, he and Cannon took a few minutes to don their breathing gear called the Mark 9, the prototype specifically designed for making deep dives from the PTC. Umbilical fed gear, despite the drawbacks of dragging around the equivalent of a garden hose, was essential at depths of 600 feet where the pressure approached 20 atmospheres. Scuba tanks, even large ones, would be depleted in a matter of minutes at such depth. Barth and Cannon dropped fins first through the hatch in the floor of the PTC and through a short trunk. The water was cold, in the mid-40s Fahrenheit, with their umbilicals trailing behind them, which, as you gather, is a kind of hose that's feeding the gear. Barth and Cannon swam over to the lab. Along its 60-foot length were various valves, clamps, and vents to check and adjust as part of the unbuttoning procedures for parking the lab on the seabed. One of Barth's jobs was to blow the skirt, which meant releasing overpressure from inside the lab to create a little air pocket like a porch just below the hatch in the dive station. Standing a couple of steps up a ladder, Barth turned a valve to blow the skirt, then yanked a few levers to unlock the spring-loaded hatch, a heavy steel square of about 4 feet. With a good shove, the hatch should pop open, but it wouldn't budge. Barth banged haplessly on the hatch, succeeding only in bruising his hands. At that point, he and Cannon had been in the water about 12 minutes, each working as quickly as they could through their separate unbuttoning checklists. It seemed to Barth that his buddy should have rejoined him at the hatch by now. Concerned, Barth left the hatch and swam around the habitat looking for him. All the while, Barth's breathing rig was giving him trouble. He found himself huffing and puffing hard, and something didn't feel right. The water was dark, though much clearer than they had expected. Cannon was nowhere to be seen, and Barth was beginning to feel uneasy about being alone on the ocean floor, unable to open the hatch, unable to communicate with anyone, unable to swim for the surface, wondering where the hell his buddy went. And why such difficulty breathing? He swam for the PTC and felt as though he might black out before he reached it. The Sealab program was ultimately canceled, in part because of an accident on Sealab 3. But what was learned from these deep diving techniques of Sealab are still with us today and went on after the program to be used by the Navy for military dive purposes, but minus the element of the underwater space station. The offshore oil industry very quickly picked up on these techniques because it was moving into deeper water to set up oil operations, and it needed a workforce to do things on places, friendly places like the bottom of the North Sea. And here they had the methods that they could use to develop a workforce to do that. Again, a modified version. Nobody's actually in the station on the ocean floor, but the diving techniques are in use. And the scientific element of this, still with us. It was, there were a number of habitats built worldwide after Sealab in the 60s. Jacques Cousteau was very interested in this and had developed some undersea habitats, as they were called, of his own, in part because he met George Bond and learned that maybe this wasn't such a preposterous idea after all, and Cousteau being the guy he was, he jumped in and got interested in and gave some effort to this, as did some others. And so out of all those sea bases, there is one remaining scientific-oriented sea base left in the world, and I'm sure you all know what it is because all this stuff about underwater living is so well known that I don't even need to mention it to you. It's called Aquarius. It's off the coast of Florida, and it is a very direct descendant of Sealab, and in fact the research boat that they use to take divers out to the location of Aquarius is called the George F. Bond, and now you know why. Thank you very much. And naturally, you can buy the book here if you'd like afterwards. I'd be happy.